Hello Operations Management students. In this video we will cover the second half of Chapter 10. One supply management decision that many companies have to face is whether to make things themselves, which is known as insourcing, or to outsource to another company. So insourcing is where we produce inputs from within the firm. Outsourcing is where we get our inputs from outside of the firm. There's also a make or buy decision. Do we go ahead and produce the inputs ourselves, or do we buy them from an outside supplier? And then offshoring is when we decide to outsource to a producer that's located in a foreign country. What do you think? Do you think it is always wise for a company to try to do things themselves, to insource? When should a company outsource, and is it ever wrong to offshore? This is an insourcing-outsource flow chart to help with the decision. And basically, we would start at step 1. And if the answer is yes, we insource. If the answer is no, then we go to the second step, and so forth all the way through to determine whether we should insource, buy from a current supplier, or buy from a different supplier. This problem is in your study guide, so follow along and then try to work the problem and see if you can come up with the correct answer. The supply manager at a dishwasher manufacturer is assessing the company should purchase the pump from a supplier or assemble the pump in-house. Forecasts suggest that 15,000 pumps are needed per year. The annual fixed cost to assemble the pumps are $120,000 per year. The variable cost per unit to assemble the pump are $25 per unit. The pumps can be purchased for $30 per unit. Does the cost analysis support insourcing or outsourcing the pump assembly? So first, let's figure out the total cost if we were to insource the pumps. And to do that, we take variable cost times volume plus the fixed costs. So the information given was that it costs us $25 per unit in variable costs for 15,000 units plus $120,000 in fixed costs. So if we multiply this out and add it to the 120, we would come up to $495,000 per year if we do it ourselves in-house. To outsource, we just take the price per pump times the volume, so $30 per unit times 15,000 units. So to outsource only costs us $450 per year. So obviously we would outsource in this case if we were only considering financials or economics. If the decision is to outsource, suppliers must be identified, evaluated, selected, and managed. The processes that are used to identify, evaluate, and award businesses to suppliers must be linked with an organization's strategic objectives. So this is a flow chart that diagrams the process. We analyze how much money we have to spend and what we need, develop a source of strategy, identify suppliers, we assess and select the suppliers, and then we manage the relationship. One thing that's often done is a spend analysis, and that's a process of identifying what purchases are being made by an organization and from whom. A spend analysis can find that there's a lot of waste and that maybe things need to be simplified. For example, Boeing found that it was buying 200 different types of safety glasses when 2 or 3 different types would have sufficed. Just a local example, HU at one time we had many different types of printers, copiers, and scanners on campus, all of which required different toner cartridges, even different maintenance companies to fix them. And one of the things we did a few years ago was to eliminate and get down to a couple of different types from the same vendor so that we could manage our supplier relationship a little bit better. This is a matrix of different sourcing strategies, and I'll go through each quadrant one at a time. So with strategic strategies, strategic purchases represent a high spend level and are also high risk. Typically, these purchases are unique and core to the firm's performance. So typically we're going to use one or two suppliers, and we're going to build partnerships with them to foster collaboration and innovation. Bottleneck purchases are high risk and low spend, and typically are not core to the firm's performance. But lack of availability can cause delays. So with bottleneck purchases, we use at least two different suppliers to assure supply, but we're also looking to develop new suppliers and explore using different materials. Leverage purchases are low risk but represent a high level of spend. They typically involve standard goods or services where many possible suppliers are available. So with leverage purchases, we standardize purchases across the company, use competition to select suppliers, and consolidate purchases with one or a few suppliers to get discounts. Lastly are non-critical items. These are typically a low percentage of overall spend and have little impact on performance. With non-critical items, we use electronic catalogs, vendor-managed inventory, and corporate credit cards called purchasing cards to lower the transaction costs of purchasing. Using a purchasing card, the user directly purchases non-critical items without involving the supply management department. So these non-critical are routine things that don't involve a lot of thought. Another thing that companies need to think about is what's the optimum number of suppliers to have. So supply-based optimization is the number of suppliers to use. Too few increases shortages and price risks, and innovation may be limited. Too many suppliers increases complexity and makes some supply management difficult. Capabilities and location of suppliers are important. Proximity impacts ease of communication, transportation costs, and community perceptions. A great example of that is the GM plant in Roanoke. You see a lot of suppliers that locate near the GM plant because that helps with communication and lowers transportation costs. And you see that with other industries where they tend to cluster in near to each other to again facilitate communication and transportation. Another consideration in choosing suppliers are, especially with international suppliers, are if there are any trade barriers, tariffs, or even trade incentives that would make trade easier or more difficult. And then also what's going on globally may impact access to markets. So with the COVID-19 issue, one of the things that has come to the surface is that the U.S. relies heavily on China for many of its medical devices and even pharmaceuticals. And that has caused a little disruption in the supply chain that needs to be revisited. This chart illustrates the spectrum of supplier relationships. In the past, they were very transaction-oriented, which led to adversarial relationships. It was mainly focused on price, and it was very short-term transactional in nature. More recently, more and more companies have realized that it makes sense to have some collaborative supplier relationships, especially with suppliers that are significant to the company. And that's more like a partnership. The focus is long-term. It goes beyond just the lowest cost, and it builds mutual dependent relationships. So generally, when a company is looking for a supplier, they'll put out a request for proposal or quote, and that describes what the customer wants, and then the supplier responds with cost and other data for consideration. Sometimes put out for competitive bidding, and that's where price is going to be the most important factor. Here, I think oftentimes the school districts will put out a competitive bid for building projects or for fuel for their buses. And usually it goes to the low-cost bidder. Another way to assess and select suppliers is the weighted point model, and that's where you're looking at different categories, and you give weights of importance to each category. So here's an example, and this is also in your notes, where we've got 3 different suppliers, A, B, and C. The categories of performance are quality, delivery, and price. And quality gets a 40% weight, delivery 40%, and then price a lower weight of 20, so your total weighted score of 100. Then we rate each of our suppliers. So we rate supplier A with quality, delivery, and price scores, and we multiply that times the weight to get a weighted score. And we do that also for supplier B and C. And as you can see, when we total the weighted scores for A, for B, and for C, supplier B with a 3.8 has the highest score. So all other things being equal, we would choose supplier B because they had the highest weighted score based on the performance categories that are important to us. So in your notes, I gave you this problem, and I also gave you the score and the weights for each of the categories. What I'd like you to do is multiply each supplier's rating by the weight, and then sum the score for each supplier to determine which supplier you would choose. So go ahead and pause the video and work on that. So here's a little chart with the answers. For supplier A, if we take our 4 rating times 10% for design, we get a rating or a score of 0.4. Delivery 30% times 2, we get 0.6. Warranty 20% times 5, we get 1. When we sum up these scores, and price 40% times 3, we get 1.2. So when we sum up the scores, supplier A would have a 3.2. We do the same thing for supplier B and C, and we add the total weighted scores, and in this case, supplier C is who we would choose because they had the highest weighted score. Of course, this is all quantitative. There are qualitative issues that go into choosing suppliers, but based just on the quantitative information, we would go with supplier C. A couple of other ways to select suppliers: an online reverse auction. A typical auction, the way it works, the purchase goes to the highest bidder. A reverse auction is where a supplier bids for a buyer's business, and basically the bid's going to go to the lowest bidder. Negotiation, that would just be a bargaining process where you work back and forth with suppliers to get the price and terms that you need. Supplier scorecard, that's where you track the progress of basic supplier performance areas. Supplier certifications, we talked in previous chapters about ISO 9000. That might be something that we require. And then also supplier relationship management, where we gather data to track how suppliers are doing in their pricing, service, delivery, etc. Information sharing is when buyers and suppliers basically share systems, and often that's done through an electronic data interchange, where orders are triggered automatically from a buyer's system to a seller's system. So that's it for Chapter 10. Make sure to participate in the discussion question, do your quiz and assignment, and if you have any questions, make sure to visit our virtual classroom on Tuesdays and Thursdays between 8:30 and 9:45 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks.